Yes. Yes. Now we are live. Okay. That's good. Yes. And then let me go on with my presentation. I hope my screen is seen by everybody, right? Can anybody, do you see my screen, Melissa?
I sure do.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, okay. Thank you. So, good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or salam in my native language. So let me begin showing you one of the beautiful views of my lovely city, Baku, which means city of winds. So it's our fourth session in 2022, but actually we have organized more than 35 events beginning from April 2021. So let's go on with our agenda. So actually we begin our agenda with greeting, which I have already done. I greet each of you. And I will go on giving a little bit information about my sponsor, so-called Enterprise DNA. And then I will take on just 1 minute to define our winners among the participants in previous session. And then our lovely Melissa Coates from USA will start her session, and after session we'll have Q&A session. So Enterprise DNA is sponsor of our meetup group, which has more than 1,100 people, and it gives 3 full scholarship or membership with full access into its portal. So and the winners are just drawn, in each session by me. And Enterprise DNA has a great content related to Power BI and other Power Platform products, including Power Apps and Power Automate. And one more information about Enterprise DNA. Actually, Enterprise DNA organizes some events in different months. For example, the next event is going to be happen on May from 23rd till 27th, so-called Reporting and Data Visualization Summit. So you may register for this event. And as for today's speaker, we have speaker from USA, from Texas, if I'm not mistaken, and Melissa Coates, who is going to talk about what you need to know to administer Power BI. And what I would like to tell you is about one diagram which has been sent me by my friend from Pakistan, Rahim Zulfikar Ali. This is a great material, great info. I hope Melissa will give the necessary information about this diagram in next minutes. And then as for our next speakers, we have wonderful speakers like today's. So in April, we're gonna have Pragati Jain from United Kingdom, from London. And also in the second half of April, we'll have Helen Wall, who is LinkedIn instructor from USA, from Texas. And in May, we'll have Heine Ilmarinian from Finland. So all these speakers will talk about Power BI. And also, I would like to give you a little bit information on my YouTube channel, our YouTube channel. All the sessions are recorded and are just shared on YouTube channel. And one more information, just I would like to tell you is that this session is recorded and we are live streaming. So I think it's okay for you. If not, so please be so kind, tell me, or you may leave the session. And it's time to define our winners. I will switch my screen and I will take only just 1 minute, 1 minute, just nothing more. So let me switch my screen to Excel file. Here you may find the list of attendees who have attended the previous session. The number is roughly 75, but the draw is done between among the people who have attended session more than 55 minutes, roughly 1 hour. So in this case, the number of people is roughly 23. So here you may find the number of unique list of these kind of attendees, which is 23. And here I have my simple Excel functions, index and rand between. So I'm just going to press F9 and I will count back from 3, 2, 1. When I come to 1, I will release my fingers. Thus, I will define my winners among the attendees of previous session. It's very possible that one name will be appeared for 2 times. If this case happens, I will repeat the process again. So let's get started. I'm just pressing on F9 and counting back 3, 2, 1, and I'm releasing my fingers. So these are the people who won 1 year, membership into Enterprise DNA platform. So now I'm just I'm just stopping sharing. I stop sharing my screen and I say, stage is yours, Melissa. So you may share your screen and you may go on. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I am happy to be here. Hopefully you can see me and hear me and all that good stuff. We are here to talk about administration of Power BI today. My name's Melissa Coates, and I'm talking to you from North Carolina, so the east coast of the US, so quite far away from where you're located. I'm self-employed and I'm a specialist in governance and administration type of topics with regard to Power BI. And that makes me a little bit different from most Power BI people. And I spend most of my time these days either doing some technical writing for Microsoft, and there are a couple of links here. And also I've got an online course. So if you like the content that you hear today, we go into tons and tons more detail in the course. Let me backtrack 1 second to the cover page, and I'm going to put this in the Zoom chat. I cannot see the YouTube chat, by the way. So I'll rely on you for that, okay? That's where you can find these materials if you'd like a copy of this slide deck. What our goals are for this session is really to figure out, well, what is the scope of the Power BI administrator role, and talk a little bit about why it can vary so much from person to person. And we're going to introduce the breadth of what these responsibilities might be. We can't go on a deep dive in really any of the topics, much less all of them, just due to time constraints. So consider this an introduction to all the things you want to think about. Here's our agenda. We're going to start with a little bit of a high-level conversation about responsibilities and really who should be a Power BI administrator. Then we'll take a turn more into some practical things. We're going to start with good old tenant settings and why they're so important. We are not going to review them individually or anything like that. Think higher level. And then we're going to do a very quick discussion about premium, gateways, security, and so forth. To the extent that we have time, we'll touch on a few topics with auditing and monitoring. My suspicion is that we will likely be out of time by then, but we'll see how that goes and how many questions you all have. Since I can't see the YouTube chat, Ilgar, I'll rely on you for that. I can see the chat over here on the Zoom side for those of you that are logged in that way. Having said that, let's get started. And if you do have a question, pop it in. And when we get to these transition points, like the items I showed on the agenda, we can pause and take those questions as they come. So let's talk a little bit about administrator responsibilities. And as was shown a couple minutes ago, this nuke diagram just got refreshed yesterday. I don't want to go through this in depth. At the bottom here is the link where you can download it. It's on the diagrams page of my website. My purpose for showing you at the beginning of this session is that Power BI is a really broad set of tools. And if you have someone that is administering or overseeing Power BI and doesn't have a good grasp of what Power BI really does and what users need to accomplish, they're going to have a difficult time. And so ideally, your best administrator is someone that really understands what's happening end to end, even if they're not hands-on and getting involved directly with all of these things. Here's the thing. The Power BI administrators are really important because they affect how good your users' experience is. So if we think about that, Power BI is a self-service platform, and people are going to read things online about what they can do. And when things are disabled and turned off and they have no idea why, or things are happening that they don't understand, the administrator has so much control over user experience. Another resource that I want to make sure that you're aware of is this thing called the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. We published the first pieces of it fall of 2021. So it's been out a little more than 6 months now, I believe. And the one thing that I want to point out is that system oversight or system administration, same thing. It's listed last here on the roadmap, but not because it happens last in a sequential way. This is more of a chicken and egg problem, if that's an expression you're familiar with. It's placed last because you have to know what's going on and make good decisions about how you want to govern and oversee your environment before you can actually do a good job from a practical perspective. So, super high level, what are we trying to do with self-service BI, and what should the administrator be thinking about here? And you might be surprised to hear me say, but the very first thing that I want an administrator to think about is user enablement. How do we help people get things done? So if you have someone in your organization whose default mode is just to say no, or turn as many things off as possibly can in the name of reducing risk, that's not user enablement. So how can we help people get things done within the guardrails that we need to implement? And those guardrails are the second and third thing, the internal requirements we have and the regulations we have to comply with. But it's really important to have all of these really be of equal importance. Now, that of course will depend on, what type of business you are and that kind of stuff, but user enablement is really important. So how the administrator gets involved is that, let's say we've got some governance guidelines and policies, and the administrator helps enact those or implement them. The administrator is going to help us support all those internal processes that we need to follow in order to get things done the right way, or according to our regulations and requirements, to say it very formally. And then the third one is help for a broader adoption of Power BI. And you might be saying, Melissa, why do I as an administrator really care about adoption? So let me define adoption for you just very briefly. This all comes from that Power BI adoption roadmap. Organizational adoption is where the administrator's mindset is at. This is where we are talking about how effective our governance and data management practices are. User adoption, this is the most common term you use, and it's usually used as an umbrella term for all kinds of adoption efforts. But specifically, how we use this term in the Power BI adoption roadmap is that your specific users, your people, think of those people that are creating data models and creating reports, and even the consumers, they're continually increasing their knowledge. They're getting better week after week. And so that lets them use Power BI in an effective way, right? And the third one is solution adoption. think here about you've been handed a set of requirements. So, all right, a month later, you're done and you produce a set of reports. How do we know that those reports are getting the job done? So this is all about impact and business value. So they're all super, super related to each other. But the administrator really helps with these governance and data management pieces, which are going to absolutely impact the whole rest of the story. Now, the word administration, each one of you that are listening to this are going to have a slightly different perspective on where administration starts and ends. And depending on how your role is defined, you might say, oh yeah, I get involved with the data architecture and I also get involved with security. And yeah, I'm going to help people with deployments. You get the idea. So how you define it is an important thing to figure out from a roles and responsibilities perspective. And it's going to look different from a day-to-day basis for different people. And keep in mind that most Power BI administrators are what we would refer to as accidental administrators. And they're also usually part-time. Administering Power BI is usually not their only responsibility. There's a question in the chat about the difference between data governance and data management. And I think of data management as how are we publishing and storing our data models and things around that line. So even things such as where are we storing our data flows and how are we managing the data lake underneath and all those sorts of things that are related to literally managing the data. And I think of governance as more of a broad term of let's get things done in a optimal way, a secure way, the way we want people to get things done. The other thing that is really going to make a big difference about what you get involved with specifically is, well, where do you sit with regard to how the BI approaches are in use? So if you are an extremely heavy enterprise BI organization, then all of that data is going to be centralized, the report ownership centralized, and that means you make different decisions than, say, on the entire other side, where the decentralized people in the business units take responsibility for all of the pieces. And then there is the middle, which we say the data side is centralized. We've got fewer data models and lots more people are producing reports off of those data models. And that all is going to affect your decisions and things you get involved with. And by the way, all three of these modes are probably in use all at once and probably even by the same team, by different people. So they're all happening. And so I wouldn't expect you to say we are absolutely one or the other. The other thing that's a big factor is things internally, such as what are your maturity levels with regard to data management? And by that, I mean something, for instance, do you have a good process for checking and verifying content before it's deployed and changed? Things like that. Change management, for instance. What's your data culture? What things are valued? How many people are allowed to get in there and create BI artifacts and publish them for others? And then there's lots of external factors that actually affect the administrator's day-to-day life, compliance and industry and competitive influences. And what I mean by that is if you've got an executive who says, we need to get this done and we need to get it done fast, that might impact some choices that you make. When we say the word administrator, there's a handful of roles that have that in its name. The Power BI Service Administrator is the one that I'm referring to collectively when I use that term typically, but we can also usually think of the service, the gateway, and premium as kind of all the Power BI Administrator. There's also a report server administrator, and there's also the workspace administrator role, which I don't think of purely in this same context. Here's a list of common responsibilities. We're going to briefly review a number of these during this session, but the whole point here is that there's a lot of different things that you can get involved with. And the things that aren't yours alone to handle, there's other teams and other system administrators you're going to have to work with from time to time. So once again, roles and responsibilities and who's responsible for what is a really important thing. All right, let's talk next about who is allowed to be a Power BI administrator. And I'll pause for some questions as soon as we discuss this, which will only take a few minutes. So I first want to ask you, do you know who is permitted to be a Power BI administrator? And there's this balance because you want to allow people to get things done. Remember, we said user enablement is a goal, but the administrator is a very high privilege role. So that does introduce additional risk if you just give it to way too many people. So if you have more than a handful of Power BI administrators in that role, I would challenge you to look at why and is that necessary? And we're going to talk about a couple of ways that you can handle that here. But first, there is, who gets to manage the Power BI service? And there are 3 roles in Microsoft 365. And by that, I mean, here in the admin center, I'm here in role assignments. And where I'm going to start here is this Power BI administrator. The global administrator, the Power Platform administrator, and then that specific Power BI administrator role all get to manage the Power BI service. And that middle one might be a surprise because they get Power BI along with their other responsibilities to manage, say, Power Automate, Power Apps, etc. So usually, what is most common for people is to assign individuals to that Power BI administrator role, knowing that these other 2 will inherit as well. So let's say down here, we've got 3 different people, and we are going to assign them to that role. Okay, that's all well and good, especially if you follow what I said and we only have a handful of people. But what if you also want to use a group to collectively manage your Power BI administrators? And there's lots of different reasons that we would do that. We've got to use groups over in the tenant settings. We might use it for some various security access. We might want to do some notifications, etc. And so what you might consider is, if I do want to have a Power BI administrator group, do I also want to do those individual assignments? And gee, that means I'm managing it twice. So I would like to make you aware, in case that you're not, what you can do these days is create a group. So down here, I've got just a Power BI administrators group. I've got 3 people assigned to it, and that role is assigned to the group, meaning we are going to get to administer this group in one place, which is great, knowing that these 2 still always inherit. The other really nice thing is if you wanted to manage that group, say someone in the BI team, for instance, if groups are usually managed by IT and you have to submit a ticket, that sort of thing, a group owner could be assigned and basically delegate who manages that. So if I pop back over here and we look at Power BI administrator and I look at my members, I have one administrator here that's directly assigned, and I have a group that's assigned. So just an idea for you in terms of improving and easing the management burden. The other types of groups that you might have besides the Power BI administrators group is something like a system support group. So you might use that for certain types of alerting. You might even use it for users to contact if they need help from a support perspective.
Excuse me, Melissa.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, actually, Anthony is asking, is that an AAD administrator group?
It sure is.
Yes, and also he leaves a comment that, and he says that, and risky if that person leaves a business under a cloud. Actually,
Okay.
it's related to.
Okay. The other types of groups you might consider creating, just giving you ideas here, are things like a gateway administrator, a capacity administrator, and then here, if you choose, you could say system support is separate from user support if there's different people that handle different aspects of managing that from a Power BI perspective. Now, you've heard me say, let's only have a handful of administrators, but what if occasionally there's someone who legitimately has a need to be a Power BI administrator? They just don't need to be assigned that role all the time permanently. And that's where something called privileged identity management comes along, and it's a feature in Azure Active Directory. And it does require an elevated Azure Active Directory license. I think they call it a P2 or Premium 2 license. Most larger organizations already have those higher level licenses, but you do need something extra. How this works conceptually, you set up what we would call a role and eligible members. So let's say my Power BI administrator identity management role has 10 people that we've said are approved to, if they need to get in there, they can if they need to. That person says, I need to go in and check some things today, or maybe I need to update a tenant setting, whatever. They submit a request to activate the role. If you want, you can have someone approve it. It's always logged, so you don't have to have this delay if you don't want to. Then that person is a full-time member of, I shouldn't say full-time, a full member of the Power BI administrator role, but just for a certain period of time. So maybe they asked for 6 hours or 8 hours, and then it's going to be automatically removed from the role when it expires. And so this is really helpful for managing this need without the undue risk of people having the elevated privilege all the time. And I've got a link here for where you can watch a blog post and a video for a little bit more information about this. All right, I think we're caught up on questions on the Zoom side. Any questions from the YouTube side that we need to address?
Not yet. So you may go on.
Sounds good. All right, we've decided who our administrators are. And one of the very first things we want to start thinking about is tenant settings. If we're ranking importance, this is right up there at the top of the list of important things to get right and do very purposefully. Now, one thing I should clarify right up front, if we pop over to our tenant settings, and we'll just pick anything. So here in my demo tenant, I've got create workspaces and who's allowed to create workspaces. So you can see here, I've got a workspace creators group, the administrators group, the support group, a couple of center of excellence groups. You see, I'm mentioning this because the Power BI administrator can manage every single one of these settings, but they can't actually go do all of those things in the entire tenant unless they basically grant themselves permission by being in a group that has permission to do the thing that's in the tenant setting. So that's kind of an important thing to know conceptually, easy for me to say. I'm going to talk more about this here in just a second, but what I would like for you to do with tenant settings is first make sure you review every single one of them, and I'll elaborate here in a second. And I want you to document the decisions that you made. If you choose, for instance, to disable a certain thing, why, or who told you you had to do it, that sort of thing. I also want you to document the settings for users. Now, 2 and 3 here might be the exact same thing, or number 2 might be kind of some private backend information for the system admins only. And the one for users, I want you to include, well, if I want to do this thing, what group do I have to ask for to belong to, and how do I go about getting approved to be in that group? If that would be a confusing thing for some people. You can track the changes that happen over time to your tenant settings in the activity log. You can also create alerts if you need to. That's all very helpful if you end up in a situation where, yeah, I've got 40 people that have been assigned the administrator role. We can't take it away because everybody will scream, right? If you're just stuck in a situation like that. And finally, I'd like for you to audit those tenant settings regularly, preferably maybe once every 2, 3, 4 months. And that's because new settings sneak in all the time. And you want to make sure that you know that they're there and the default that got set is exactly what you want it to be. So let's talk a little bit more about reviewing these tenant settings. First thing you're thinking about is it enabled or disabled? And the next thing you're thinking about is, all right, then do I need to limit it to certain security groups? If the answer to that is yes, do I have an existing security group that I can use? Or do I need to ask for a new security group? So for every single one of these, that exercise really needs to be done. Granted, some of the tenant settings apply to the org as a whole, but this is an important thing to do and to document. In terms of why it's so important to give the users visibility into here, there is no reader role that allows you to just view what the settings are. So that means somebody's reading online, they can do something like push apps to users. They find it doesn't work. This is a piece of documentation they can refer to and understand, oh, it's disabled, I have to ask to be in this group, etc. You can use Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, which used to be called Microsoft Cloud App Security, for creating policies to send you an email if a tenant setting changes. So here's a screenshot of what that might look like. So we're saying that the application is Power BI and that the administrative activity is true. And that means that the way I have it configured, it's going to shoot an alert. You can do other things. You can even loop it into Power Automate, etc. This is really just an awareness that something changed. Again, I've got another blog post and video that you can refer to. And just in case anybody joined late, I am going to put in the chat over here one more time where you can find these materials so you can grab links like this and so forth. All right. Any tenant setting questions that we should tackle? If it's highly specific, we might save it to the end, but anything of a general nature is a good time to do it.
So there is no question on YouTube. And also
okay. Sounds good. So let's talk a little bit about managing the Power BI service. Now, I'm not going to go into every single teensy tiny aspect. I'd have to keep you here for 4 or 5 hours to do that. Let's hit the big ones. Managing workspaces. This one is huge. And here in the admin portal, the Power BI administrator can see the existence of all workspaces in the tenant. And that includes, if I do a sort, that includes all of the personal workspaces. If I'm trying to find the little thing to drag this over. So they can't actually do anything yet. There's an item on the release plan with these personal groups, but they can see the existence of all of these groups, even if they don't have access to them. Now, here's the thing. If I click on this and I go to manage access, I can change the access for any of these workspaces. That's another massive reason why it's a high privilege role, because even though the default access is just visibility to all the metadata, the existence of the workspace, the ability to create and update the workspace roles and give a role to yourself or someone else is absolutely something that an admin can do. And that's really helpful when they need to jump in and help, right? But it does represent a bit of risk, especially if due to your industry, you've just got a lot of sensitive data or whatever. Embed codes is another big one to manage. And so what I recommend here is that you make sure your tenant setting is set to where publish to web is either completely off or set only for the people that allow it. And so the Azure AD group that I choose to use is called Power BI Public Publishing. So public is in there on purpose so that it's very self-describing, and some security person that really just doesn't have any idea what publish to web means. I'm trying to be self-describing with the group name. So make sure there's that. You can also follow the activity log for when a new embed token is created and just validate or audit them on a regular basis, because anything like this is absolutely available publicly. If you think just because I'm only using it on our private intranet or something like that, it still can be found publicly. Organizational visuals is another really, really good one. And so what I recommend, this is all about using custom visuals. So things beyond what comes available inside of Power BI Desktop. You might do things ever so slightly differently, but the first thing I suggest that you think about doing is set the tenant setting for certified visuals, or visuals using the Power BI SDK, I think is how they call it in the tenant settings currently. Think about using only certified visuals. Doesn't mean they're foolproof safe, but it means they've been through a review by Microsoft. That will make it take effect in the service. There's also a group policy setting that will make the same thing happen in Power BI Desktop. And that's really important to make sure both are done the same, because the last thing you want is somebody to spend oodles of time in Power BI Desktop only to be stuck as soon as they try to publish to the web. I see the question. I'll circle back to it in a moment. Any exceptions to that you can handle using organizational visuals. And by the way, if you decide to say, we're going to turn off certified visuals entirely, whether they're certified or not, and handle everything through organizational visuals, that's a valid thing that you can too. That's a way to have a lot more control over exactly which versions you're using and when they're installed.
Sorry for interrupting you. Anthony Sonato, yes, asking a question. Do we need to track and validate the embed tokens if publish to web is disabled under tenant? Is the question.
So I would say yes, making sure that you know if any embed tokens are active, because the tenant setting is just who can go and create them. It doesn't mean if there's an embed code on the list, it no longer works. So yes, definitely two different things. But the organizational visuals is a really nice aspect. And we could talk a lot longer about managing these items. But if it's not something you've given attention to, look into that a little bit further. Azure Connections is another area. So you've got a couple of things here. You've got tenant level storage and workspace level storage. This is all about, do I want to associate my data flows with an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 storage account so that I can actually get to the data behind the scenes? Because if you don't do that, which by the way is assigned in the workspace, so just to make sure you all know exactly what I'm talking about here, let me pop over to a workspace and go to the settings. Oh, interesting. Here, let me show you a different one just because they've changed the UI there ever so slightly because it's on already. So let me go to one where it's not on already. Oh, phooey, I turned it on this one too. Anyway. Weird. Oh, there it goes. Okay, that was interesting. This workspace is storing the data flows in this specific data lake storage account. Now, the really important thing to realize is that just because you set a storage account over in the tenant settings does not mean any of the workspaces are automatically assigned to it. It's still a workspace by workspace setting. So be very careful of that and make sure that that's something that you manage when a workspace is initially created, because once you start creating data flows, you can't switch the storage account. The other item down here is if workspaces are allowed to send data to log analytics. That's this one down here at the bottom on the Azure Connections page. So that's a new set of auditing data that's a little bit different from the activity log. This is more about tracking performance and that sort of thing. So these last two are more about, I'm going to let my workspace admins decide if they want to specify Azure storage and use it for these particular purposes. So I see the question about, let me go back a second to, is there a risk with Power BI certified visuals? Why would an admin disable that from a security perspective? And here's the thing, just because it's certified does not mean that it is absolutely free of risk. It does mean that Microsoft has done a code review, and it does mean that they followed the requirements. It does also mean that it's not transmitting any data back to its service or the owner of the custom visual. Now, if I pivot for just a second, there's tons of custom visuals that have a legitimate need to transmit data back to the owner or back to the service that's running the custom visual, that is, because it needs to run an algorithm, for instance. Those will never be able to be certified under the current provisions of certified visuals. Now, the reason that all of them in general have some risk is because A, they're not produced by Microsoft. They are produced by somebody in the community, could be a reputable company like SQL BI. Of course, we're going to trust their visuals. Are you going to trust some guy named Mark in, Ohio that published it? Maybe, maybe not. The other thing is, if a bug does come up in one of the custom visuals, and because you're getting the custom visual from AppSource, every time they would submit a bug fix or a new version, it has to go through that whole process. So if something was wrong, it could be wrong for weeks before the vendor's even allowed to fix their custom visual. So that's one reason why some organizations decide, I'm going to manage it all manually through organizational visuals, because then a bug fix comes out, you decide, I'm going to go ahead and upload it. Yes, there is a list of what Microsoft does to certify custom visuals. I think you should easily be able to find it in Docs. I'm not going to go hunt for it now. And that's good to know that there is another great session on risks with custom visuals. With regard to monitoring health of the system, the Power BI platform has its own support site. It's only going to list the big issues that are broad for public awareness. If there's something smaller or something that's happening only to a small subset of customers, I would not expect to have them list it publicly on the support site. Depending on which pieces you're using, the Azure status shown here at the top right is important. Things like Azure Data Lake that we were just talking about, things like Azure Embedded, et cetera. Lots of reasons why you would need Azure status as well. There's also an area in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It is important because it's where you'll find if there was a big, serious incident or outage, that's where Microsoft is required to provide the root cause, what the user impact was, how long the outage happened, that sort of thing. And they're required to do that because they would have an SLA or a service level agreement that requires them to provide a refund if they don't hit their I don't even know what their SLA is for uptime. But if that were affected, I've not heard of that happening, but that's why you get that kind of information. But again, it's only documented for the really big ones. Now, with regard to service updates, the Power BI Desktop and the Power BI Service both are updated monthly now. You cannot opt out of when the Power BI Service gets updated. There is also not the notion of channels like Microsoft 365 has. So if you've seen things like, oh, Excel, we get the newest Excel features on the fastest possible cadence, even if they're still in preview. Power BI doesn't currently do something like that. What you can control, however, is when desktop gets installed and updated, I should say, and when the gateway gets updated. But here's the deal. You absolutely, to the extent you can, you want to keep all three of them aligned with the service, because you've got the M or the Power Query engine underneath the covers that needs to match. So from a support perspective, desktop technically only supports the latest version, and the gateway supports the last 6 versions. From a user support perspective, and this is people that have problems, I'm trying to use Power BI and I can't connect to my data source, right? Or I'm getting errors and they need help. So you need to decide how much your internal support team is capable of handling. Now, is this the same people as your Power BI administrators or different? Depends on how you want to handle that. But make sure that you have some level of support available and that it's clear to users how they go about getting help. And the Power BI Adoption Roadmap has a whole section that we talk about user support on its own. There's also a whole bunch of different ways that you can get support from Microsoft, and administrators specifically have their own way to go and get support, as do users. So that's a helpful thing. One other thing that you want to verify if you're new to your Power BI implementation is where's your tenant located, because you want it to be located, closest to your users and your data sources, et cetera, if you can, and you can get this relocated. Everything doesn't get migrated. You would create a support ticket with Microsoft. They can do some pieces of it, but there is absolutely a bunch of manual stuff that needs to happen. So if you're at all concerned about where the region is, move it sooner rather than later. The other thing to be aware of is that a premium node can reside in a certain geography, like let's store this data up in Canada, that sort of thing. The last piece in this section that I want to kind of sneak in this section is really user machines and devices. This may or may not be your Power BI administrator. This might be more like your infrastructure team or your desktop team, that sort of thing. But every single month, desktop has updates, and they also have QFE releases, which stands for Quick Fix Engineering. So that does mean that it does usually get more than one update per month. There's just only the one that gets the big splash and the big blog post. And then there's all these other pieces, right? Like Report Builder and the mobile app, et cetera, et cetera. But what's wildly important is if you're going to have people that are sharing Power BI desktop files, they need to be on the same version. And there's multiple ways to handle this with regard to how that software is pushed. Few other things that you're going to need to think about installing on user machines, drivers. So things like, I need to connect to Oracle. There's certain drivers. There's a provider if you're going to use Analyze in Excel. There's great external tools. If you are using any sort of custom connectors, There's also group policy and registry settings. We can talk a little more about these towards the end if anybody is interested, but these are things that would modify the user experience just a little bit further. All right, told you that this would be a pretty fast, high-level introduction to everything. So I see we're caught up on the questions over on the Zoom side. Anything from the YouTube side we want to touch on?
People are not as so active on YouTube, but there is a comment on, say, Zoom from Nico Bots.
Yep, he's sharing a link to, yeah, so I assume that you'll pick up these links and put it at the bottom of the YouTube page when we're done or something. So comments like that, I won't read them out unless you think it's important. So let's go ahead and talk just ever so briefly about premium, because this is a huge topic that we could discuss for a very long time. So there's just a, how about if I fix this typo, because it is going to bug me if I don't. All right, we have license modes that affect the workspace. And this is very important from an administrator perspective because it has wide-reaching effects. So the first one is, I've got user licenses. That's our free and that's our pro license. And a workspace would be assigned that license type. We've got then user-based licensing, but that's also premium now. And that's the newer premium per user license. And then we've got the capacity-based license. And those are the P SKUs, the EM SKUs, and the A SKUs. And the newest version of premium is Gen 2. So let me just show you what this license mode looks like really quick so that you know for sure what I am referring to. And in the workspace settings on premium, it's right here. So this workspace happens to be assigned to pro. Now, this is really important because it impacts who can access a workspace. If you only have a free license, you can access your personal workspace, your own My Workspace, and you can access workspaces assigned to premium capacity. If you're a pro user, you can access those items as well, plus any assigned to pro. And then a PP user can access all three types. And this right here in the middle is the big takeaway, is that only other PPU users can access content in a PPU workspace. So you have to be really careful about which license you choose. So lots and lots of features that we get through premium. I'm not going to do a commercial for why you should have premium. There's just some really major reasons that it becomes important, especially as you grow larger in your deployment. There are certain features, though, that are not available to PPU. This idea of free users is only a capacity-based notion. Bring your own key and specifying a geography for data storage, you would have to go with capacity instead of PPU. And if you wanted report server, so another place to publish content besides the service, you get one of those licenses for free along with your premium capacity. A little more to it, but that's the gist. Some people find it really helpful to use PPU and premium together. So here, for instance, we would have our dev and our test workspaces assigned to PPU, and we would only have our production workspace assigned to the full-fledged premium capacity. So that's the one where we have all the users, all the ones with the free licenses. And this usually works because down here, dev and test, only a few people are usually going to have access to that information and the data and the reports before it gets to production. Now, let's think a moment about capacity size. So this is where we're talking about buying a real premium capacity. So let's say you bought a P3, and so you have 32 vCores. And there's a chart that Microsoft publishes that says, oh, a P3 gives you, this much horsepower, basically. And let's say you assign 3 workspaces to that capacity. It's a lot better in Premium Gen 2 than it was in Gen 1 in terms of sharing resources. It's still sharing some resources, but there's not going to be nearly as much data set eviction and fighting for resources because the amount of memory that you get for this capacity is assigned per data set, actually, not even per workspace, but for each data set. And so that didn't used to be true. So it's a lot better, but still, you would be sharing. The other way that you can start to approach it is I'm starting with that same 32 cores, but I'm going to divide it up into 3 different capacities that I create over on the Power BI side. And so then I would have different workspaces that assign to each one of those capacities 1, 2, and 3. And if you've got departments that are needing to manage their own capacity, right? Or you basically just want to manage and secure them separately, that's where this starts to be really helpful. And this year, we're a little bit on the data management side, but the authors and the users publishing content are probably not going to do this planning. So here's where the capacity administrator and or the Power BI administrator would get involved. Now, the other thing we want to think about is Autoscale. So let's say we've got whatever our capacity size is, we've got some workspaces assigned to it. Some reports over in Workspace A start to get some spikes. It's month end, so we've got a whole bunch of extra activity, for instance. So if we've got it set up to do so, it will use Power BI Embedded, and it will add an extra vCore for a period of 24 hours. And then it will automatically scale itself down. So this is a way basically to let performance go ahead and dictate when it scales up. Now, that does incur an additional cost. So cost management in several different ways is something that you as an administrator might get involved in. And one piece of that is this one. So there's a couple different ways that you could decide to manage this particular cost. And the first one is over in the Power BI service, what's the maximum number of vCores? So if this was 32, right, maybe you set your max at, say, 40, right? And then okay, the activity will get throttled if we scale up to 40 and there's still too much happening. The other way is because it's done with Azure Embedded, you can set a limit over in Azure for a spending limit. All right, Anthony says, what's your main KPI to decide whether or not to purchase another capacity? We find the Gen 2 metrics app is far from being useful in a short time window, hard to see the long-term usage increasing on all of the premiums. And that is a little bit of a pain point. I agree. I think I would look at the trending, right? So if you are getting, for instance, one thing that in addition to the metrics app that you get, the workspace management metrics that you can start logging and sending to Log Analytics can start to help you piece together over time what's actually happening. And so if you see that trend and basically see that, oh, it's time to scale up or scale out even further. So it's not easy to figure out. I agree. So if anybody else has any suggestions for Anthony, certainly feel free to pop them in the chat. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about gateways. The purpose of a gateway, we want to reach data sources from the cloud service. So this is an issue that comes up after we've started publishing our content to the Power BI service that wouldn't come up while someone is just working in desktop. There's 3 reasons why we would say we need to introduce a gateway. Oh, let me backtrack a second. Caroline's asking, is Power BI Embedded a completely different license than Premium? And yes, let me go back a few slides. So Power BI Embedded is what we call an A SKU. And then regular Power BI and Premium is usually a P SKU. EMs are special case. You don't see them. You got to talk to your Microsoft people to even buy them. So I'm going to ignore them. They're not terribly commonly used, though they do have a isolated purpose. So Power BI Embedded is generally marketed towards a software vendor that wants to put Power BI, say, in their product. Whereas Power BI Premium, the P SKUs like P1, P2, P3, is generally marketed towards organizations that need all of the extra features of Premium. So they're marketed towards slightly different audiences, but an organization can use Embedded and a vendor can use Premium. And, Embedded, for instance, the A SKU, you can pause that service, whereas Power BI Premium, once it's on, it's on. So there are some distinctions. So some overlap, some distinctions for sure. So yeah, if that's new, definitely something to kind of look into and be prepared to spend a little time with it because it gets a little confusing. All right, when we need a gateway. First, we've published to the Power BI service. Second, our data source is in some sort of private network. I'm going to elaborate on that in a second. And we need some sort of security isolation. So first, we're in the Power BI service and we're just trying to say, run an imported data set or use direct query or use live connection to say an analysis services model. Here's the thing. If somebody has done all this work in desktop, they publish it to desktop, there's not a gateway set up. Maybe you have personal gateways turned off. We'll talk about those here in a second. They might have an urgent help desk ticket to say, I can't reach my data source. I can't set refresh. I need help. So this is one of those situations where from a support perspective, you need to be prepared to act pretty quickly. The next reason is that data source you're trying to access is either on premises or inside of your organizational network, or it's basically inside a virtual machine, for instance, inside of Azure, because then it acts just like it's sitting on premises inside your data center. Or you have a data source sitting inside of a virtual network or a VNet. And so even something like Azure SQL Database, if it's sitting inside a virtual network, you're going to need a gateway to access it because its cloud endpoint, the public endpoint, is no longer available because of the virtual network. So be very careful if you hear someone say, oh, it's Azure SQL Database, we don't need a gateway. Well, maybe more and more organizations are investing in virtual networks to secure their cloud infrastructure. The third possibility, and here's where it's just situational, is you're using a certain kind of connector or web page function or whatever. And what Power BI needs to do is it needs to delegate the execution of it to your local machine. And it satisfies some sort of security isolation concerns. I don't understand it deeply. I just know it exists. And I know that people try to use web API connectivity instead, that sort of thing. But you might run into gateway requirements because of things like this, how the solution was developed. And we have 3 types of gateways. The ones that we've had for a very, very long time are standard mode and personal mode. Personal is intended to run on one person's laptop. Standard mode is the one that we like to have a multi-machine cluster, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. The newest one is a virtual network data gateway service. And this is something that Microsoft will maintain. Only works for premium workspaces though. So the personal mode, like I said a second ago, it's running on one person's laptop. It works for one user and, for instance, lets them refresh a data set and goes ahead and lets them reach their data sources. This relies on one person's laptop being run and, logged on, and it's not a scalable solution. So usually we want to highly limit who's allowed to install and run a personal mode gateway. That can be done in the Power Platform Admin Center and with some PowerShell commandlets. So highly recommended from a governance perspective. Standard mode, we like this because we've got a gateway cluster. And what we do is we register multiple data sources for this cluster. And then we specify per data source which users are permitted to access that data source. So then when a data set refreshes, it is saying, oh, are you in the user list? Okay, can I find this, basically the connection string from the data set registered as a data source? Oh, okay, fine, I'll go, talk to the data source through the gateway cluster. And there are administrators that are assigned per individual gateway cluster. So this is a really good solution and where most organizations are at, so that this data source can be reused by, this set of users could be 300 people. The virtual network gateway service is very, very similar, with the exception of they're sitting inside of that private virtual network, and the data set is sitting in a premium workspace so that you can use this functionality. I'd love to see this opened up to Pro as well. So fingers crossed over time. Here's a little reference chart for you of what's allowed for all three of them. In the sake of time, I'm not going to review it, but this will kind of help you figure out, which things are not allowed by which type of gateway. Now, you heard me say gateway cluster a couple of times. So here's what I propose you do. First, have a production gateway cluster that is at least 2 machines. So that's why several machines are shown here. What we're shooting for here with the multiple machines is high availability. One of them has a hardware issue, you don't have a single point of failure. So if you have hundreds of users refreshing models every day, using live connection to analysis services, using direct query, and you have a production gateway machine that is one and only one machine, you have risk because you have a single point of failure. It also does load balancing. So if just 50 refreshes come in within a short period of time, it will distribute the load and have to queue them up less. And rotating updates, here's where, let's say we do have 3 machines and it's time to do the monthly gateway software update. I can do that on machine 1 while 2 and 3 are still up and running. Okay. And then cycle through them. So I don't actually have to bring my gateway down just to apply updates. You still might choose to do it in off hours on a weekend, but you wouldn't have to. And then the other piece of the puzzle is a dev test gateway cluster. I actually don't care if this one's just one machine. I don't care if it has fewer resources. What I do care about is that you have a place to apply the update, check that everything works okay, before you go and you touch your gateway machines, because it's not a nice, easy one-click process to roll back to the former gateway. You'd have to kind of set yourself up with, a machine image snapshot or something. So having a dev test gateway to check what's going on before you promote to production is important. James has a question about for the virtual network, when you say premium, does that include PPU? I'm pretty sure that it does. As far as I'm aware, that is not a capacity only requirement, that PPU will work. So if anyone knows different, go ahead and toss that in the chat. But as far as I'm aware, that should work. Just remember, if you start using it, every single user that uses content from that workspace, whether it's from an app, whether it's from a workspace role, they all have to have PPU. So all right, that brings us to securing and protecting Power BI content. Time-wise, we are shooting to be done with all of the content within about the next 20 minutes. That we're shooting for 90 minutes overall. We have 2 hours set aside for this session, so we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So just a heads up time-wise, I'm sorry I neglected to say that at the beginning that this one is longer than the normal 1 hour session. You can see why though. There's a lot of stuff. And I was crazy about cutting so much content. All right, securing and protecting Power BI content. We want our administrator to think about, to know what's where, and to assist where necessary. So if we step through this very dense, busy page, we've got source data in a bunch of different places, right? Probably out of scope for the Power BI administrator, but security is happening somewhere. Okay. We've got files stored in OneDrive, SharePoint, servers, people's laptops. The biggie here are things like our Power BI desktop files. How about Excel workbooks that you may or may not publish up to the Power BI service? You might have source data files. You might have other files associated with, your external tools. There's lots of things here that we want to make sure that they're stored somewhere safe. Then you've got the actual content that's published to the Power BI service. Then we've got, well, we might have content that's exported from the Power BI service. Where is it going to go? We might be exporting or downloading PBIX files. Hopefully that you're not relying on that, and you're keeping the source one, over here in a nice, safe, secure location. We might have, the PowerPoint and PDF exports. There's the little data export thing. How about subscriptions and their attachments? If you're using that kind of subscription, right? And various other spots. So there's data everywhere, and being aware of what are we asking users to do in terms of particularly files that aren't yet published to the service and stuff that comes out of the service. What are we asking people to do? And the administrator can of course help with this sort of thing. This might also fall under maybe your center of excellence if they're helping users understand, here's your guidelines for what to store where. So from a file location perspective, you just heard me say this, clear guidance for your user community. That's all I'm asking for. Now, a brief mention about user licenses, because the general rule is we need to know who everybody is first, whether you have a free, a pro, or a PPU license. These are all the user licenses. So usually we say, yeah, the Power BI service just needs to know who you are. And then Pro and PPU just unlock extra features accordingly. There's exceptions to that though. Good old publish to web is an exception. If we use one flavor of Power BI embedded, and that's when the app is managing authentication rather than Power BI. So then Power BI would just say, hey, I know of one user or one service principal, and you handle the rest of that over on the application. And then there's also the report server piece where it has its own licensing model. So some things to think about there from the user license perspective, but mostly about where's the content sitting and how am I securing it if it's not in the Power BI service. And one thing that is often important is Azure Active Directory conditional access. Now, this is something that in most organizations that are medium to large, this is going to be somebody else doing this, somebody from, say, your security team or whatever. But it's really good to be aware of what is happening or what is even possible so that you as a Power BI administrator can go talk to people about these sorts of things. And in a nutshell, conditional access is all about saying, I have a condition. And based on that condition, I'm either going to block access or I'm going to grant access. And so a good example of this is I've got a set of users or groups, and they're logging on from a personal device, and we don't want that, right? Azure AD conditional access can do all sorts of things like that. And then we can integrate it with Power BI service, which I'll tell you about here in a second. Within the Power BI service alone, there are a whole bunch of places where the authors, so basically the self-service users that own and manage the content, the kinds of permissions they can set themselves. And I'm not going to go through this whole page. Down here at the bottom is a link to, I've got a blog post and a video that walks through this particular thing. But if your administrator gets involved with auditing of the data or helping to manage the workspaces, knowing what the heck is going on and what the options are for security is really important. From a gateway security perspective, on a gateway level, so per gateway cluster, if you will, we would set administrators. Watch that though, because over in the Power Platform Admin Center, they use the word users when they mean administrators, which is confusing when you get into Power BI because users are inside of the data source, not inside of the gateway, if you follow me. But I bring this up because this section is about protecting the data, right? So every data source has stored credentials, or it lets you do single sign-on, which passes the user identity back to the source. So basically then you're saying, I'm using direct query back to Oracle, for instance, and we're going to implement security back there. So these kinds of things are really important to know who's going to be using this data source in the gateway, and the stored credentials that are in there. Does that line up properly? There's also sensitivity labels, and these get really interesting with some of the things that you can do. There's a handful of tenant settings that control what you can do with sensitivity labels. This screenshot here is showing you an example of how in the Power BI service here, I might have a report that's set to highly confidential. I might have another one that's set to restricted. And there's a little report in the admin portal in the Power BI service that lets you know just kind of at a high level which labels are being used. But what you want to do with these things is you want to create what I usually refer to as a data handling policy, which means if it's set to restricted, what does that mean? What can I not do usually? And so it's very important to work with your security team and whomever to set up these labels, because they're set up in Microsoft 365 and they apply to way more than just Power BI. They apply to all of Office and Azure Purview and all sorts of stuff. So this is usually kind of a big project to figure out what our sensitivity label convention is and then start using it in Power BI. But where things can start to get really interesting is, for instance, I'm using Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, and I have a policy set up to say, if I have, let's say, a report set with a highly restricted sensitivity label, that's fine for people with access to view it. I don't want to let them download it. And this is basically a nice way to block a download and protect this data a little bit further. And at the high level, how you would implement that is the first piece is a conditional access piece over an Azure Active Directory. And it points to the Power BI service as a connected app that Azure AD is going to control. And then that Defender for Cloud Apps, that's that thing that used to be called Microsoft Cloud App Security, has the session control policy that says, oh, okay, if I see this sensitivity label, what am I not allowed to do? I'm not allowed to do the download. So there's not a ton of choices we can do yet, but that block of highly confidential data is one really, really nice use case. So this is how, from a high level, those three pieces work together. The last piece is encryption keys. Lots of times people just don't even think about these, but you've got encryption keys associated with your gateways, with your premium capacity. If you're bringing your own key, you might have report server. So figuring out where you want to store these securely, preferably in some sort of password vault, is an important thing for the administrators to handle. All right. Any questions over there on the YouTube side before we hit our very last section?
You may go on, Melissa. Thank you.
All right. So this is a section near and dear to my heart that I'm going to have very, very abbreviated. So let's just cover a few of the high level things that you might want to think about. Usage monitoring is massively important. So what are the kinds of things we want to think about? We want to know, well, what content is most critical? So for instance, I might see that a report is very critical because, oh, it's getting run hundreds of times per week. So then if the data refresh, for instance, isn't as reliable as it should be, I should know that as an administrator so I can jump in and help. Or if I see a report being shared from someone's personal workspace is suddenly getting hundreds of views per week, that is something that needs to reside over in a regular workspace and get out of that personal workspace. Things like that help us adequately support the content, even if I don't own it and manage it, but helping the users that do own and manage it do a better job. You might need to track changes of what occurred when and by whom. This could not only be that, oh, Joe published an updated version of the report last week, could also be what security changes happen and when. Auditing the activity log data is invaluable for compliance audits. If you ever are subject to security investigations, the activity log is one important piece of that puzzle. Adoption efforts. So you heard me way at the beginning talk about those three types of adoption. So not just usage stats, because adoption is not just, oh, let me look at, are my reports getting used more this month than last month? It's more than that. Is it being used the way we intend it to be? If you've got so many downloads or exports to Excel constantly, that's not using the system optimally. So that is not achieving Power BI adoption. So think of adoption of a digital tool as more about using the technology the way it was intended to be used, which is, of course, way, way, way harder to track than just plain old usage stats. Trustworthiness levels. How about looking at, especially for the critical content, maybe we've got, I'll say 10 data sets, for instance. Of the 10 data sets that are used massively across the organization, how many of them are certified? How many data sets support more than one report? So That's where we want to get into data reuse and using live connection from reports back to data sets and helping people do a better job rather than every single Power BI desktop file that has a report create a new data set, because that just gets unscalable over time. And you might say, I'm an administrator. I am not responsible for that kind of stuff. And that's okay, as long as somebody else is responsible for that. License usage, especially if you have cost constraints. So if you've got only a certain number of pro licenses you can hand out, who's not using their license, that sort of thing. Usage patterns, we talked about the exports. Maybe you've got a ton of subscriptions happening. Is that the usage pattern that you want? So it can find, where some refactoring might be necessary, that sort of thing. Training opportunities. So this is where we see things like too much sharing from my workspace, one of my favorites, that sort of thing, where you can say, without being creepy, we see that this is happening. Let us point you to some resources where here's a better way to do things, right? Here's how to use Analyze in Excel live connectivity instead, that sort of thing. Suspicious usage patterns, right? Suddenly you see a lot of data exports, just went through the roof in the last 2 days. That's unusual. So from a very, very basic perspective, what you would be looking for to start with usually is you go after the activity events of Power BI and then get all of the workspace information that comes from one of the REST APIs. And you pull it into Power BI and do some reports. And lots of community blogs and videos go here. And this is an okay place to start, especially if you're figuring out, how the heck do I even get this data, right? So you can have a very simple solution to start with. The limitations of this is that you won't have historical data, and you won't have all of your raw data saved elsewhere for formal auditing and compliance purposes. And more than likely, especially, with the APIs and such, more than likely, you've hard-coded, the key or the password for how you're getting this data, and that is not a good practice. A more end-to-end solution would generally look like this. If I start across the top, the activity event data is absolutely the first thing that we always want. Then we'd start getting some more data from various APIs. There's lots of them out there. We could then start marrying that up with data from Microsoft Graph. And so, for instance, if we want user information, so for instance, the activity events will show me an email address. I might also need the user's first name, last name, department name, etc. How about group memberships? If I go and I get the workspace security and I see that, there are 3 groups assigned, well, I need to know who's in that group, right? So there's a variety of things that we can get out of Microsoft Graph to marry up and augment the auditing data and make it more valuable. And then there's also some gateway logs. I didn't mention those earlier, but they can be enabled on each individual gateway machine, turning those on and bringing those in if you need to do more thorough analysis there. And you don't have to use PowerShell, but it's very common, the thing that you use to coordinate running all these scripts. What you do want to do, something like a data lake, or even a file system. You can keep it really simple, but what I would want you to do, even if you're just starting with this piece, grab the raw data and drop it into some location before you do anything else with it, because these are JSON records that have lots of different elements, and new data elements are sneaking in all the time, and they change based on what item is being logged, which type of event is being captured. So you don't want to parse it out while you're extracting the data. You want to store the JSON data. That also, if it's the kitchen, so to speak. It's only accessed by administrators and your security auditors or whom else, not your general users. If you want, you can create an auditing database, or you can go straight to Power BI. Kind of depends on your current feelings on designing for data lakes and databases. So not a discussion we need to have today. On the release plan, coming this fall to public preview is getting workspace activity events sent to Azure Log Analytics. So that will simplify the data acquisition of this piece. So instead of sending it to, say, a data lake, we'll say, oh, okay, that data is already being sent to Log Analytics if you enable it. And then, of course, I expect that a lot of organizations will still need to build on a lot of this other stuff. So from a monitoring perspective, know what normal is. And because too many times people, oh yeah, we got a whole bunch of data, but we're not really looking at it or analyzing it, or we don't know when we should actually act on it. So somebody that really analyzes it, accumulate the history. And especially if you've got auditors that are going to ask you questions from, 10 months ago, that sort of thing. Also wildly helpful for trending. The raw data files here, it's just kind of spelled out for you if you download these slides. You heard me say this before, why that's important. And then correlating it with that other data, like I showed across the top of the diagram. So lots more to it. And there are other pieces of auditing as well that we didn't cover. But that's the end of the materials that I had prepared. It's not every single possible thing, of course, but it's the biggies that, I can fit into roughly an hour and a half. So the last thing in this presentation are just a few links, and I'll leave these up for a minute. If you would like to see that, here's where you find the slide deck. So in the chat, Nico says, let me pull this over to a different monitor. Is there such an end-to-end Power BI auditing solution that one can buy? Is there an open source project perhaps out there where someone started building? Yes. So there's a couple things. The thing that you probably want to go hunt up is, hang on just one second here. From an open source perspective, here we go. I will put this in the chat. Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, I agree. Rui now works for Microsoft, and that is excellent, excellent news from the perspective of bringing the kinds of things that he did from a community member perspective back when he was one of us. And now, he knows what people really need as it's getting built inside of Microsoft. So that's where I would start. The other thing that you might look into, Power BI Sentinel is much bigger than just auditing. But they do have it built in where they'll capture that activity log data for you inside of your Power BI Sentinel application. And so this is another way, if you've got the budget money and you say, hey, I would like to just have something. The last I heard, their reports aren't extremely detailed is in terms of analysis of the activity log data, but they do gather it for you. But what they don't do is go get all the other pieces, last I heard. Let's see, Anthony says about sending the Workspaces activity to Azure Log Analytics, Is it still workspace by workspace, or is it for the whole tenant? We have several hundred workspaces. Yes, it's still workspace by workspace as far as I'm aware in the Azure Connections. We allow the workspace administrator to configure activity logging. And then it would be a workspace setting on the Azure storage side. So hopefully that will evolve to be something where we can say for the entire tenant, send it over. The problem with that though is it's only premium workspaces right now. So it wouldn't be the entire tenant, but still anything where it's easier. And yes, Caroline's question is log analytics for premium. Yes. So there is a really nice page. Wonder if I can find it fast enough. It's pretty new. Let's see, it's kind of at the top of, there it is. There is a really nice page that just came out earlier this month where they kind of do a roundup of all of the premium features. And let's see, might be under Azure Monitor, or is it even on here? We'll have to get them to add log analytics and Azure Monitor onto this page because it should be. Yeah, thanks, Anthony. He's sharing a link to Just's solution for extracting the Power BI activity log with Azure Data Factory. There's a few different community solutions that use different ways to go after that data. And so, yeah, his is really good as well. And so just watch out for the ones that say, when you're extracting the data, I want these 15 columns because you're giving up everything else. So just kind of watch out for that. Let's see. Caroline says she saw this in the next release. Let's see, we are in 2021 Wave 2, performance and usage tracing for analysis services. This is, I believe, the exact same thing we were talking about with the log analytics. Yeah, so here's the log analytics piece. Now, the other thing that is very important, if I go to the other release plan that's active right now, so 2022 Wave 1, if I go and I find this one, this is the long-term historical tenant activity retention with all of the audit logs and all of the nice built-in reports. This is the one that's got a public preview slated for September. And Rui Romano, that we were talking about a couple minutes ago, is deeply involved with this effort right here.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for your contribution to the community. I really appreciate it. If you don't mind, I would like to end streaming on YouTube. And I kindly ask everybody to turn on their cameras. Just if you have questions, please feel free to ask. If not, so let's take one picture for memory, and then we can end this session.
Just want